She didn't cry. That was the first thing people remembered afterward. Not the sound of the slap, not the way her head snapped sideways, not the gasp that ran through the crowd like a cold wind through dry grass. What they remembered was that she didn't cry. Her, name was Clara Whitfield, and she was 23 years old, standing in the middle of a cattle auction in the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1887, holding a bidding card in her hand and minding her own business. She had ridden 14 miles that morning on a borrowed horse to be there. She had saved 11 months of wages to have a real bid at a small plot of grazing land that had come up for sale on the edge of the valley. She wasn't looking for trouble. Plus, she never was. But trouble had a way of finding women who stood alone in rooms full of men. His name was Deke Calloway. He wasn't a man anyone in the territory would call respectable, but he was the kind of man no one said that to directly. Not with him standing right there anyway. He drank before noon. Plus, he owed money to half the county and laughed about it. He had a temper that moved faster than his brain, and a pair of hands that had gotten him thrown out of 2 towns already. He came to the auction that day not to buy anything, but because men like Deke Calloway went wherever there was noise and opportunity, and an open auction was both. When Clara outbid him on the land, coolly, simply without drama, he walked over to her and slapped her across the face. Just like that, in front of everyone. The auctioneer stopped talking, and 24 men stood frozen in the August heat. Someone's horse shifted its weight against a fence post, and the wood creaked, and that was the only sound in the world for a long moment. And then, from the far edge of the crowd, a figure stood up from where he had been sitting on a water trough, unhurried, and began to walk forward. His name was Thomas Running Water, which he was Apache. He was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet. Not empty, just very, very still on the surface. He had been coming to that auction for 3 years. He had never caused a single problem. Most of the men there couldn't have told you much about him beyond that he showed up, he bid fair, he paid what he owed, and he left. They were about to learn considerably more. Plus, this is a true story. It happened the way it happened, in a place where the law was slow and justice was faster, and where one quiet man decided that what he had just witnessed was something he wasn't willing to pretend he hadn't seen. What happened next took less than 4 minutes. People talked about those 4 minutes for the rest of their lives. Clara Whitfield had been awake since 4 in the morning. She had gotten up in the dark, lit the small oil lamp on the kitchen shelf, and stood at the wash basin for a long time looking at her own reflection in the water. Not out of vanity. She wasn't a vain woman, but because she had learned over the years that it helped to look yourself in the eye before a hard day. To remind yourself of what you were walking into and why. Today was the Garfield County Land Auction, held every second summer on the flat ground behind Haskell's Feed and Grain out near the edge of the town of Red Rock, Arizona Territory. Clara had known about this auction for almost a year. She had planned for it, budgeted for it, written the date in pencil on the inside cover of her Bible, and circled it 3 times. The piece of land being offered, a 40-acre strip along the lower edge of the Salado Valley, was the kind of property that only came available once in a long while. Good in my opinion, grass, which reliable water from a creek that ran even through dry months. Not huge land, not grand land, but honest land. Working land, and the kind of person could build something real on. Clara worked as a seamstress out of a one-room shop she rented from a widow named Mrs. Farnsworth on the main street of Red Rock. She was good at her work, better than good. She could copy a pattern from memory after seeing it once. She could alter a garment so neatly that it looked like it had been made for the new person from scratch. The ranchers' wives came to her. The merchants' wives came to her. Even the judges basically. Wife had come to her twice, though she had never said a word to Clara in public afterward, which Clara had long since decided was simply the way things were, and not worth losing sleep over. She had been saving since the previous August. Every spare coin went into a tin box she kept under a loose floorboard in the corner of her shop. She didn't drink, and she didn't gamble. She mended her, own clothes, and resold her own boots, and ate simply and without complaint. By the time the auction date arrived, she had $112 saved. It was enough. She believed the land wasn't prime. There were bigger spreads going up for bid. Most of the serious cattle money in the county would be chasing those, not a 40-acre creek parcel that was only useful to someone who actually intended to work it. She dressed carefully that morning in her plainest, most presentable clothes, a dark blue skirt, a gray blouse with a small white collar, and her good boots, which she had polished the night before. She braided her hair and pinned it back. She ate a piece of bread with a smear of butter and drank 2 cups of coffee, standing at her counter, thinking through the day. Then, she went to Mrs. Farnsworth's barn, borrowed the old roan mare that the widow rarely rode anymore, and headed south toward Red Rock. The road, to be fair, was quiet that early, and the sun came up slow and flat across the desert, turning the scrub and the red rock orange and gold before the heat set in. Clara rode at a steady walk, not hurrying. She had given herself 3 hours for a ride that would take 2. She liked arriving early, which she liked to reach a place before it filled up with people and noise. She got to the auction ground around 9:30 in the morning. The field behind Haskell's was already setting up, long ropes staked out to form a square perimeter, a rough wooden platform at one end where the auctioneer would stand, chairs and benches brought out for the crowd, a chalkboard propped against a fence post with the day's lots listed in white. Clara tied the roan to the rail alongside 24 other horses and walked in. She registered at the entry table, a plank across 2 sawhorses, manned by a boy of maybe 16 who looked surprised to see a woman holding money, but took her $2 entry fee and gave her a bidding card without comment. Number 44, and she found a place to stand near the middle of the crowd, not too close to the front, not hidden at the back. Close enough to be seen when she raised her card. The auction opened at 10 o'clock sharp. The first several lots moved fast. A parcel of, rocky hillside land went cheap. A water rights agreement on a northern tributary drew some heated bidding from 2 ranchers who clearly had old business between them. Clara watched without participating. She had come for one thing, and she was going to wait for it. Lot 7 was the Salado Creek parcel. The auctioneer, a round-faced man named Potts who wore the same brown vest every year and spoke in a rapid sing-song that the crowd had learned to follow, announced it with a brief description. 40 acres, Salado Creek frontage, grass suitable for small herd or subsistence farming, clear deed, no encumbrances. He opened bidding at $40. Clara raised her card. Plus, she wasn't the only one. A rancher named Hollis from the north end of the valley came in at $45. Clara went to $50, which an older man she didn't recognize went to $55. Clara went to $60. Hollis dropped out at $65 with a small shake of his head. The unknown man went quiet after $70. Clara stayed in at $75 and raised to $80. And then a voice from the left side of the crowd said $85, loud and loose and slightly slurred even at 10 in the morning. She didn't turn her head right away. She heard the auctioneer acknowledge the bid. She raised her card. 90, 95, same voice. She heard a low laugh mixed in with it, the kind of laugh that was meant to be heard. She raised her card. 100. A brief pause. Then 105. She had $112. She knew that. She had counted it 3 times the night before and again that morning before she left. Actually, she raised her card. 110. Another pause, and longer this time. She didn't look at the other bidder. She didn't look anywhere but straight ahead at the auctioneer, who was watching the crowd with his gavel half raised. 110 going once, Potts called. Going looked twice. Done, the voice said, which not as a bid, as a statement, as if calling it off, and sold. Potts called, and his gavel came down to number 44 for $110. Clara lowered her card. She let out a slow breath through her nose. She was going to need to arrange a short-term loan to cover the remaining gap with the registration fees, but she had already spoken to the bank manager about that possibility 2 weeks ago, and he had said it was manageable. She had done what she came to do. She was walking toward the registration table at the side of the field when he stepped in front of her. She hadn't looked at him during the bidding. She looked at him now. Deke Calloway was a tall man, not well built, but wide through the shoulders in the way of men who have done physical work at some point in their lives without doing much else to take care of themselves. He had dark hair going gray and a beard that was more neglect than intention. His eyes were pale and slightly unfocused. He smelled of whiskey and old smoke and the particular staleness of a man who has been wearing the same clothes for several days. He was holding his bidding card loosely in one hand and looking at her with an expression she recognized. she had seen variations of it her whole life, from men who were angry about something they couldn't quite name and had decided the nearest available target would do. "That was my land," he said. "Plus," Clara kept her voice level, "it was an open auction. I won the bid. I was letting you run it up." He smiled without anything warm in it. "Figured you'd drop out, which women don't buy land." "I just did," she said, and moved to step around him. Pretty much, he slapped her. It was open-handed and hard, and it caught her across the left cheek and the side of her jaw, and the force of it turned her head and staggered her sideways. Her bidding card fell from her hand. I think her ears rang. She caught her balance on nothing, just her own 2 feet finding the ground again, her own spine straightening by instinct. She didn't fall. She didn't cry. She put her hand to her face and felt the heat spreading across her cheekbone, and she turned back and looked at him, and her eyes were completely, utterly steady. The crowd had gone silent the way crowds go silent when something has crossed a line so far, so fast that no one has yet found the words for what to do about it. The auctioneer had stopped mid-sentence on the next lot. 2, in my opinion. Men near the front had turned, but not moved. Someone at the back said something under their breath. Deke Calloway was still smiling. He said something else. Clara wouldn't repeat it afterward, and none of the witnesses could quite agree on the words. Something ugly and dismissive, the kind of thing a man says when he wants everyone to know he's not worried about consequences. And then, to be fair, shadow fell over him, not from the sun, from a man. Thomas Running Water had been sitting on the edge of the water trough at the far right of the crowd. He had been there since before the auction started. He came to this auction every other year, occasionally bidding on pasture land or grazing rights on the eastern parcels that bordered the reservation boundaries. He was known to the regulars as a quiet presence, unhurried, polite, not given to conversation. He was Apache, Chiricahua, though most of the men in that crowd couldn't have told you the difference and wouldn't have tried. He was somewhere in his late 30s, lean and dark, with the kind of stillness in his body that came from spending a great deal of time outdoors in country that rewarded patience and punished noise. He had stood up from the trough the moment Clara's head snapped sideways. He wasn't running when he crossed the field. He was walking. That was the for what it's worth thing people kept coming back to later. He was walking, steady and unhurried, the way a man walks towards something he's already decided on, in which the question is not whether, but only when. He stopped 2 feet from Deke Calloway, which Calloway looked up at him. The smile was still on his face, but it had changed shape slightly, the way a candle flame changes when a window opens somewhere in the room. Thomas Running Water didn't raise his voice, and he didn't reach for anything. He stood there for one moment, just one, and looked at Deke Calloway with an expression that the men present described afterward in several different ways, but which all amounted to the same thing, the expression of a man who has seen worse than you and is not remotely afraid. "Pick up her card," he said. His voice was quiet and clear and carried without effort across the silent field. Calloway's jaw shifted. "Look, and who the hell are you?" "Pick it up," Thomas said. Same tone and same volume. Not louder, not softer. I guess just again, in my opinion, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The sun was up and blazing, and the whole field smelled of dry dust and horse sweat. The particular suspended quality of a moment that everyone present already understood was going to be talked about for a very long time. Calloway made a decision. It was the wrong one. He swung. He was bigger than Thomas by 2 inches and probably 40 pounds, and the whiskey in him had reached the stage where it made a man feel larger than he was. The swing was fast and careless, the kind of punch thrown by someone who expected it to end the conversation. It didn't end the conversation. What happened next took very little time. Thomas moved, not far, just enough, and the punch went past him, and what came after was efficient and deliberate and educational in the way that only a certain kind of experience produces. Calloway went down. He went down hard, the way things go down when there's nothing slow or uncertain about what put them there. He didn't get up. Thomas Running Water turned away from him, and he walked the 2 steps to where Clara's bidding card lay in the dust, and he bent and picked it up, and he turned and held it out to her without ceremony, without drama, without the expression of a man who has done anything except the obvious thing that needed doing. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she reached out and took the card. To be fair, "Thank you," she said. Plus, he nodded once. And then he went back to his spot at the edge of the crowd, sat back down on the water trough, and waited for the auction to continue. It took about 3 minutes for the field to come back to life. Potts, the auctioneer, cleared his throat. Someone helped Calloway to his feet and walked him firmly toward the far gate. 3 men exchanged looks that contained entire conversations. A woman near the back started talking again, and then someone else did, and then the low hum of a crowd sorting itself out after a disruption moved through the field like a returning tide. Clara stood, actually, where she was for a moment longer, her hand still at her cheek, the bidding card at her other hand. She wasn't shaking. She noticed that about herself and filed it away as information. She had thought she might shake, and her mother had told her once that the body shook after hard things, not during them, that during it was focused, and only after did it have the luxury of falling apart. Her mother had been right about a great many things. She walked to the registration table and completed her paperwork. $110 and plus fees. She was going to need that bank conversation sooner than she had planned, but the land was hers. She signed her name at the bottom of the transfer document in clear, even letters. Claragy. Whitfield, the boy at the table, took the paper and filed it in the wooden box without looking up, and Clara turned and looked back across the field, and for just a moment her eyes found the figure sitting on the water trough at the edge of the crowd. He wasn't looking at her. Plus, he was watching the auctioneer set up the next lot, his hands resting on, his knees patient as stone. She didn't know his name yet. She would by sundown, which the auction continued. Life moved forward the way it does, even after things have shifted. The ordinary machinery of the day, grinding on over the extraordinary moment, covering it up the way a creek covers a stone, which doesn't mean the stone is not there. People kept buying land. Horses shifted. Children ran between legs. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became serious. But something had changed in that field. Everyone felt it, even if most of them couldn't have put it into exact words. Something had been weighed and judged and settled in the space of about 4 minutes, without a law officer present, without a courtroom, without any of the formal machinery that was supposed to handle such things. A man had done what he thought he could do. A woman, I think, had refused to fall down from it. And a quiet stranger had walked across a field at an even pace and made a decision that, in the way of decisions made with full deliberateness and without anger, turned out to be the kind that people build stories around. Later that afternoon, as the crowd was thinning and the horses were being untied from the rail, a rancher named Gil Hartley, who had been standing 12 feet away when it happened and hadn't moved, a fact he was going to carry with some discomfort for several years, walked over to where Thomas Runningwater was preparing to mount his horse. That was something, Hartley said, which was as much as he could manage. Thomas finished checking his saddle cinch. He put his foot in the stirrup. "She won the bid fair," he said. He rode out. Hartley stood there for a moment, watching the dust settle. Then he went home and told his wife everything, and she listened without interrupting, which wasn't her habit. And when he was done, she said good, in a tone that didn't invite discussion, and that was the end of that particular conversation. But not the end of the story. Not by a long way. Because Deke Calloway, when he came back to himself sometime in the late afternoon with a split lip and a bruised jaw and a rage that whiskey was feeding like drywood feeds fire, made a decision of his own. He decided that it wasn't over. He was wrong about that. But he was going to spend a few more days being wrong about it before the truth became fully clear to him. And those days were going to involve Clara Whitfield and Thomas Runningwater in ways that none of them, not Clara, not Thomas, and certainly not Calloway, had anticipated that morning when they all stood in the same sunbaked field behind Haskell's feed and grain, and a gavel came down, and everything changed. The land was a beginning. The slap was a beginning. The man who walked across the field was a beginning. Every real story starts twice, once in the world, and once in the heart of the person it's going to change. This one was kind of starting in both places at the same time. The name came to her through Mrs. Farnsworth. Clara had returned to Red Rock that evening, stabled the borrowed roan, washed the dust off her hands and face, and sat her work table in the back of the shop trying to do something useful with needle and thread while her mind kept looping back to the auction field. The left side of her face had gone from hot to tender to a low, steady ache. She had pressed a damp cloth to it twice. It didn't help much, but the pressing of it gave her hand something to do, which was almost as good. Mrs. Farnsworth came by, at 6:30 with a plate of cold chicken and cornbread, which she did occasionally when she suspected Clara hadn't eaten properly, and which Clara was always grateful for but never good at asking for. The widow was, 61 years old and had outlasted 2 husbands, a drought, and a fire that had taken half her barn 3 years ago. She wasn't a woman given to sentiment, but she had a particular directness of affection that showed up as food and practical information. She set the plate down and looked at Clara's face and said, "Well," and that single syllable contained an entire opinion. "I'm all right," Clara said. "I know you're all right," Mrs. Farnsworth said. "I've seen what not all right looks like, and this isn't it. You want, to know about the man." Clara set down her thread. "Is it that obvious? You've been stitching the same quarter-inch of hem since I walked in." The widow pulled up the spare chair and sat down with the comfortable authority of someone on their own property. "His name is Thomas Runningwater, which he's Chiricahua Apache from the band that settled the Eastern Reservation after the wars. He's been coming down to the valley for the past few years, doing day labor and occasionally buying up small parcels of land when they come available. He's got a sister and her family somewhere east of the Dragoons. He keeps to himself." Clara absorbed this. "Do people treat him well?" Mrs. Farnsworth made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite something else. "People treat him the way people in this territory treat any man who has sent precisely what they're used to, which is to say, better when he's useful and less well when he has sent. He doesn't seem to require much from people in the way of warmth, if you follow me. He does his work, he keeps his word, he doesn't borrow money, and he doesn't cause trouble." "He caused some today," Clara said. "He prevented some," Mrs. Farnsworth said, with the firmness of a woman who was very clear on the distinction. "Preventing trouble and causing it aren't the same thing, Clara, and you know that." Clara knew that. She picked up the plate and ate a piece of chicken because it was there, and she was in fact hungry, and because Mrs. Farnsworth was watching her in that particular way, that meant she wasn't leaving until she saw evidence of a meal. "Calloway's been sort of in town," the widow said after a moment. Clara looked up and went straight to the Red Dog after he left the auction. "He's been there all afternoon." Mrs. Farnsworth's voice was like even reporting facts the way a sensible person reports facts before opinions. Emmett Voss was in earlier for his wife's fitting, and he said Calloway's been talking. Not quietly. "Talking about what?" "About what happened. About you, about—" She paused, choosing words. "About making kind of things right," was the phrase Voss heard. Clara set down the plate. She sat with that for a moment, her hands flat on the work table. "He's going to come here," she said, which it wasn't a question. "He might," Mrs. Farnsworth said. "Or he might drink himself horizontal by 9 o'clock and wake up tomorrow and do what a smarter man would do, which is accept that he lost a fair bid and made a fool of himself and walk away from it." She paused. "He is not, by any account I've heard, a particularly smart man." Clara looked at the window. It was deep blue outside now, the last color of the evening draining out of the sky, and the main street of Red Rock was settling into its nighttime sounds. Horses, distant voices, the thin metallic note of a piano from somewhere down toward the hotel. Well, she wasn't afraid. She sort of examined that fact carefully, the way she examined things she wasn't sure she could trust. She was alert, and she was calculating, and she was aware that the situation had edges to it. But afraid wasn't the right word. She had been afraid before, genuinely, bodily afraid, and she knew what it felt like, and this wasn't it. This was something harder and quieter, the feeling of a person who has already been struck and gotten back up and is now simply waiting to see what comes next. "I'll lock the front," she said. "I'll stay TBH a while," Mrs. Farnsworth said, in the tone that meant this wasn't negotiable. They, to be fair, sat together in the back of the shop in the lamplight, the widow with her knitting, Clara with her sewing, and neither of them said much, and the evening moved around them. Nothing happened that night, which Calloway did, in fact, drink himself unconscious at the Red Dog, and was removed from the premises sometime around 10 by a bartender named Phil who had done this before with this particular customer and had developed an efficient method. He woke up the following morning on the porch of the stable where his horse was boarded, and the morning wasn't gentle with him. But morning is temporary, and so was the headache, and Deke Calloway wasn't the kind of man whose intentions got softened by a bad night. Clara found out on the second day. She was at the bank, speaking with the manager, a dry, careful man named Ostergaard who wore a perpetual expression of mild financial concern and who had, to his credit, honored the commitment he'd made 2 weeks prior and agreed to a short-term note to cover the remaining gap on her land purchase. They basically were going over the paperwork when Ostergaard's clerk came in and said that a man outside was asking for Clara Whitfield, and the way he said it made Ostergaard look up from his papers. Clara went to the door. Calloway was on the boardwalk. He hadn't, cleaned himself up much. His eyes were still carrying last night's whiskey in the way that some men's eyes did. Not bloodshot exactly, but feverish, lit with the particular energy of a grievance that has spent the night marinating and come out hotter in the morning. He didn't come inside. She didn't invite him. They stood on opposite sides of the bank doorway like a conversation that had a very clear frame around it. "You want to sell that parcel," he said. Clara looked at him for a moment. "I won't. It borders land I've been running cattle on for 2 years. He said it as if this were an argument, as if 2 years of use without ownership created some right she should recognize. "I've got an arrangement with the territory office about the creek access." "You had an arrangement," Clara said. "Arrangements change when the land sells." His jaw tightened. "I'll give you 130 for it." She had paid 110 plus fees, which had come to 118 with the registration. He was offering her a small profit and expected that to be enough. She could see in his face that he expected it to be enough, that he expected her to be grateful for the number, to view the transaction as a resolution rather than a surrender. "No," she said. 140. "No." He stepped forward, not close enough to be inside the bank, but closer than before. "You're not a rancher," he said. "You're a seamstress. What are you, I guess, going to do with 40 acres? "Whatever I decide to," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The fever in his eyes shifted, not into something calmer, but into something more deliberate, which was worse. "You think about it," he said, and walked away. She went back inside and finished signing the bank paperwork and shook Ostergaard's hand, walked back to her shop in the late morning sun, and sat down at her work table and stared at the wall for a while. She wasn't going to sell, which that wasn't the sue. The sue was that she was alone, and she owned a piece of land she hadn't yet visited, since actually the deed was signed, and Deke Calloway was the kind of man who, when he couldn't buy something, typically found other ways to get it. She thought about that for the rest of the morning. That sort of afternoon she went to see Thomas running water. She had, I think, asked around carefully. Plus, he was staying at a boarding house on the south end of town. Not the main hotel, but a smaller establishment run by a woman named Lupe Garza, who took in working men and charged honest rates. Clara walked there at 2 in the afternoon, knocked at the door, and asked Mrs. Garza if Thomas Running Water was available to speak. He came down, I guess, to the front room 5 minutes later. He looked the same as he had at the auction. Same quiet, same stillness, the particular unruffled quality of a man who takes time as it comes. He looked at her face, at the faded mark on her cheekbone, and his expression didn't change, but something in his attention sharpened. "I wanted to thank you properly," Clara said. "What you did yesterday, and I should have said more than I did." He looked at her for a moment. "You said TBH enough." They were standing in the front room of a boarding house in the middle of the afternoon in a town where both of them were, in their different ways, people who other people noticed without fully including, and Clara thought that the situation had a strange symmetry to it that she wasn't going to mention, but that she suspected he also noticed. "Calloway came to see me this morning," she said, "at the bank, and he wants to buy the land." Thomas nodded slowly. "You're not going to sell?" "No," she said. He looked at her, and she thought she saw something in his face that wasn't quite approval, was close to it. The look of someone who has just confirmed a thing they were already reasonably sure of. "He won't stop at asking," Thomas said. "I know that. Do you have family here?" "Anyone who know," she said. "I came here on my own 3 years ago. I know people, and I don't have," she paused and chose honesty over pride, "I don't have anyone with a particular reason to put themselves between me and a man like Calloway." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He looked at, the window, then back at her. I was planning to ride out to the eastern parcels tomorrow and look at the grazing land on Lot 12, he said. The Salado Creek parcel is on the way. I could ride by it first. Clara looked at him. You don't have to do that. I know, he said. There was a pause that held more communication than most full conversations. I'll meet you at the South Trailhead at 7, she said. He nodded. Well, that was all. She walked back through town in the afternoon heat, and she was aware of being looked at as she went, the way she was always aware of it, the particular texture of small-town attention that followed a woman alone who had done something people were still sorting out their opinions about. A man who ran the hardware store nodded to her from his doorway, with more intention than usual. Two women on the opposite side of the street put their heads together as she passed. She was becoming a story she understood. Not her story, but the town story about her, which was a different and less controllable thing. That evening she went over the deed one more time, spread it flat on her work table, and read every word of it by lamplight. The land was hers. The creek frontage was hers. Plus the grass basically, and the water, and the 40 acres of Arizona soil were legally, genuinely, irreversibly hers. Calloway's name wasn't on it. His years of informal use wasn't on it. His feelings about the outcome were emphatically not on it. She folded the deed and put it in the tin box under the floorboard, next to the money she was now going to need to rebuild. Then she went to sleep. She was pretty much up again before 5. She was at the South Trailhead at 6:45 because she wasn't the kind of person who arrived right on time when being early was an option. The roan was borrowed again, and Mrs. and Farnsworth had packed her a roll of bread and a piece of hard cheese without being asked, which Clara had accepted without making anything of it. Thomas was there at 7 exactly. He rode a gray horse that was neither fancy nor run-down, just solid and well-kept. He had a rifle in the saddle scabbard, which Clara noted without commenting on, and a canteen, and the same unhurried air he carried everywhere. They rode south together in the early morning quiet. The desert was different in the early hours, softer in its colors, the light still coming in sideways, and gentle across the rock and scrub, the air not yet heated into the flat blaze it would become by noon. Clara had always liked the Arizona mornings, even when everything else about her situation was difficult. There was something about the light on the red rock that she found genuinely beautiful, and she had stopped apologizing to herself for finding beauty in a place most people only complained about. Thomas rode beside her and didn't attempt to fill the silence. She appreciated that more than she would have been able to explain quickly. She had learned in 3 years of living alone that silence had different qualities. There was the silence of being ignored, and the silence of being avoided, and the silence of being tolerated, and then there was this, which was the silence of being accompanied by someone who was simply comfortable with not talking, and who extended that comfort to you without making it a statement. After about half an hour, he said, "You rode from town today on 14-mile land." It took her a moment to understand he meant the land she'd bought. The parcel was about that distance from the town proper. 14 miles isn't actually so far. No, he said, but you need to ride it regularly. I plan to, she said. Once I can arrange a longer lease on a horse, or save for one of my own. My plan was always to build on the land, not just hold it. He was quiet for a moment. Build what? A proper operation. Small one to start. Not cattle. I don't have the capital for that. But I can run sheep on creek pasture land. And if the grass holds, maybe 2 or 3 cattle eventually. I know how to do it. She paused. My father had a farm in Kentucky before we came west. I grew up knowing how to work land. I came here because there was work in town, but that was supposed to be a means to this, not the end of it. Thomas was looking at the trail ahead of them. You've thought it through. I've had 11 months to think about it. They came over a low rise, and the Salado Valley opened up below them, and Clara pulled the roan to a stop without meaning to, just because the sight of it caught her. She had, I guess, seen it before from the road, but this was different. This was with the deed in her tin box and her name on the paper. The creek was visible as a darker line of green running through the valley floor, the willows and cottonwoods along its banks standing out against the scrub. The grass was pale and dry this late in summer, but you could see where it was thickest, where the creek's influence reached through the soil. That's it, she said. The southwest quarter from that rock outcrop to the creek bend. Thomas looked where she indicated. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at it with the attention of someone who understands land. Not romantically, but practically the way a person looks at a thing they intend to respect. Good water, he said. Yes, she said. They rowed down. Plus, she was still standing at the creek, watching the water move over the stones, when Thomas said, quietly, "Rider behind us. Coming from the north." She turned. There was basically a figure on the trail above, still distant, coming at a pace that was neither casual nor fast, but somewhere in between. The particular intentional TBH, middle speed of someone who knows where they're going. Thomas had already turned his horse to face the trail. His hand was on the rifle, but his attention was on the rider in the way that attention can be a kind of readiness. Clara shielded her eyes and looked. She knew the horse before she could make out the rider. Brown and white paint, broad in the chest, a distinctive splash of color on the left shoulder. She had seen it tied to the rail at the Red Dog 24 times. Deke Calloway. He had followed them. She took a slow breath. The creek moved on behind her, indifferent and clean. The sun was fully up now, the day's heat beginning in earnest. Thomas hadn't moved. He was simply watching and waiting, and the quality of his stillness had changed in a way that was difficult to describe. Not tenser exactly, but more complete, the way a bow is tenser when fully drawn even though it looks almost still. She squared her shoulders and turned to face the trail. Whatever was coming, it was coming now. Calloway rode down slowly. He took his time about it, which Clara understood was deliberate. The slow descent of a man who wants you to watch him coming, who wants the time to press on you. It was a particular kind of theater, the kind men like him used when they wanted to feel large. She recognized it, and she refused to give it the reaction it was looking for. She stood, where she was at the edge of the creek with her boots in the soft dirt and her hands at her sides, and watched him come without moving. Thomas was still on his horse, a few feet to her right. He hadn't changed position. The morning sun was behind them, and in Calloway's eyes, which was geography and nothing more, but it meant that Calloway had to squint to look at them directly, and there was something in that small fact that Clara filed away as information. Calloway pulled his horse up about 20 feet from where they stood. He looked from Clara to Thomas, and back to Clara. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more the look of a man recalibrating, finding something in the scene he hadn't anticipated and trying to decide how to adjust his prepared speech to account for it. "Didn't know you had company," he said to Clara, in a tone that suggested he found this mildly interesting. "Didn't know I needed to tell you anything," she said. He ignored that. His eyes moved to Thomas. "Running water," he said, the way some men say a name when they want the name itself to be an insult, putting a particular flat quality into it. "You're a long way from the reservation." Thomas looked at him. In my opinion, he didn't say anything. "I'm talking to you," Calloway said. "I heard you," Thomas said. That was all he said. Just that. Two, in my opinion, words perfectly level with the particular calm of a man who's not going to give you the rise you're fishing for, and who has clearly decided this in advance, and is very comfortable with the decision. Calloway's jaw shifted, which he looked back at Clara. "I can't make you a final offer on the parcel. In my opinion, 150. "No," Clara said. "Plus, that's more than you paid." "I know what I paid," she said. "The answer is to be fair, no?" "You're being stupid," he said, and his voice had shifted, not yet loud, but moving in that direction, the way weather moves before it breaks. "This land borders my grazing run. I need the creek access. You don't have any use for it that you couldn't do someplace else." "My use for it's my business," Clara said, "and I'm not selling." He looked at her for a long moment. The horse moved under him, and he pulled it still. His hand on the saddle horn, not on his sidearm, but the sidearm was there. She could see the shape of it under his coat, and she was aware of that fact the way you're aware of a sharp edge in a dark room. Present. Noted. "This is going to go poorly for you," he said. It wasn't a shout. That was what made it worse. It was quiet, and even the tone of a man stating an expectation rather than making a threat, which meant he had said things like this before and had generally been right. Thomas moved then, not dramatically. He simply walked, in my opinion, his horse 2 steps forward and stopped, which put him between Calloway and Clara in a way that was unmistakable without being theatrical about it. "She's answered you," he said. "You got your answer." Calloway looked at him for a long moment. The morning was very still. A hawk moved tbh somewhere high above them, crossing in front of the sun and leaving a brief shadow that slid over the grass and was gone. The creek kept moving, talking to itself over the stones, fully indifferent to the particular human problem happening on its bank. Something crossed Calloway's face, some internal calculation, some reckoning of what was in front of him and what it would cost. He wasn't sober. She could tell that even from 20 feet away, even at this hour of the morning, which told her something important about the state of the man and the seriousness of his intentions. But he wasn't quite drunk enough to be careless. Not yet. We're not done, he said, and then he pulled his horse around and rode back up the trail the way he'd come, at the same deliberate pace, not looking back. Clara watched him until he was over the rise and out of sight. She let out a breath. She turned and looked at Thomas, who was looking at the trail where Calloway had been. He's going to come back, she said. Yes, Thomas said. At night, probably, or when I'm here alone. Thomas looked at her. Then, don't be here alone. Not yet. She nodded. It was practical advice from a practical man, and she received it as such. This wasn't a conversation about fear. It was a conversation about logistics, which was the kind she could have clearly and without her chest tightening. They rode the land for another hour. She walked the creek frontage and measured it as best she could by stride, and Thomas pointed out where the grass was best and where the soil went soft after rain, which he knew from riding through this valley for several years. He showed her where the eastern fence line would need to be strengthened before she could run any animals, and where a small structure, nothing more than a field shelter at first, could be positioned to catch the shade in the afternoon. He said very little beyond what was useful, and everything he said was useful, and she wrote none of it down but remembered all of it. On the ride back to town, she asked him how long he had been coming to the valley. 3 years, he said. Before that I was working up north, near Prescott. Before that, he was quiet for a moment. The war years were difficult. Plus, after them, it took time to settle into something stable. She understood that the war years meant something different in his mouth than they did in hers. She had been sort of a child during the Apache Wars. She had heard the stories from one direction only, the way children hear most history. She was aware now, as an adult, that the same events looked entirely different from the other side of them, and she had done enough quiet thinking about that over the years to have some humility about what she knew and didn't know. Is your sister's family well? She asked, because Mrs. Farnsworth had mentioned it, and she didn't want him to think she hadn't listened. He pretty much looked at her with a slight shift in his expression, not defensive, but surprised, the look of someone who didn't expect the question. Well enough, he said. Her youngest is sick more than he should be. The reservation doctor is not, he paused, not always available. She filed that away. She didn't say anything else about it then, because she could tell from the way he'd paused that it was a weight he carried, and adding words to someone's weight without anything useful to offer was something she had learned to avoid. They came back into Red Rock at midday, the sun full overhead and the town at its noisiest, and they parted at the south end of the main street with a simple exchange. She thanked him again for the morning. He told her to send word if Calloway came around. She said she would. She went back to her shop and sat down and tried to work and found that she could. Mostly, the needle moved, the thread pulled through. The actually ordinary work of the day reasserted itself in the way it always did, and she was grateful for it. But the situation with Calloway wasn't over, and she knew it, and over the next several days it became clear that he wasn't going to let it go quietly. He didn't come to the shop directly. He was smarter than that. Or more precisely, he was smart enough to know that an open confrontation in town, after what had happened at the auction, would go badly for him. He had been seen, and he had been witnessed. There were limits to how much a man could do in broad daylight in a town of 800 people, without creating problems for himself. But there were other ways. The first thing was the water. On the 4th day after the auction, Clara rode out to check on her land, alone this time, in the early morning, on a different road than before. Found that someone had diverted a section of the small irrigation channel that fed from the creek along the eastern boundary. It wasn't kind of a major diversion, but it was deliberate. The rocks were placed in a pattern that could only be intentional. Whoever had, for what it's worth, done it had done it at night, and they had done it precisely enough to redirect the flow toward Calloway's adjoining land. She, I guess, looked at it for a long time. Then she moved the rocks back. Plus, she told Thomas that evening when she went by the boarding house. She had gotten into the habit of stopping there briefly on her way back from land, not because anything had been arranged, but because the situation had developed a practical logic of its own, and Thomas had, without discussion, settled into the role of the person she talked to about the practical logistics of the situation. He listened to her description of the rocks. He nodded once. "Has anyone spoken to the sheriff?" she asked. There actually was a pause that was itself an answer. "Donahue," he said, which was the sheriff's name, in a tone that didn't editorialize but didn't need to. Well, Clara knew Donahue. He wasn't a, to be fair, bad man. He was a careful man, careful about which problems he treated as problems, careful about which people's difficulties he invested his limited authority in. She had lived in this town for 3 years, and she had never asked Donahue for anything, and she hadn't missed asking him for things. "I'll go," she said, "and I have a deed. It's legal, and I'll make the report." "I'll go with you," Thomas said. "Well," she looked at him. "You don't, I know," he said. Same tone he always used for that, and just quiet, settled, which they went to see Donahue the following morning. The sheriff's office was a small adobe building on the east side of the main street, cool inside in a way that buildings in the territory often managed if they were thick-walled and north-facing. Donahue was at, his desk, a large man in his mid-50s with a beard that was more white than gray, and the look of someone who had been solving problems in this county for so long that they had all started to look familiar. He looked at Clara. He looked at Thomas. He looked at them together with the particular expression of a man whose mental categories were being slightly rearranged, and then he settled that back down and said, "What is it?" Clara laid out the situation clearly and without embellishment. The auction, the slap, which Donahue already knew about by the look on his face, the offer, the refusal, the visit to the land, Calloway following them, and the redirected water channel. Donahue listened to be fair to all of it. He didn't take notes, but she had the impression he was recording it anyway, in the careful internal filing system of a man whose job was partly to be a library of things people told him. "The channel," he said, when she was done. "You move the rocks back." "Yes. So there's no evidence now." "I moved them back because I needed the water to flow," she said, with a patience that wasn't entirely natural. "I can show you where the channel runs and where the rocks were placed, and you can look at it and decide whether it was accidental." Donahue was quiet for a moment. He looked at Thomas. "You were there when Calloway rode out to the parcel?" "Yes," Thomas said. "He make any direct threats?" Thomas considered this. He said, "This is going to go poorly for you." To her. Donahue looked at the desk. He turned I think, pen over in his fingers. "That's not enough for me to do much with," he said. "Not with Calloway. He's got a temper, but he's not without connections in this county. And unless he does something I can prove," he hit her in front of 40 people, Thomas said. It was the flattest statement Clara had ever heard, and the most complete. He, didn't say it with anger. He said it with the calm of a man reciting a known fact, in a tone that suggested the fact's implications should be visible without elaboration. Donahue looked for what it's worth at him for a moment. Then he looked kind of at Clara and the incident at the auction, he said. "I've heard about it. I wasn't present." "No," Clara said, "and you weren't." There was a silence in the room that wasn't comfortable. "I'll speak to Calloway," Donahue said, finally. "Plus, I'll make it clear that any interference with your property is a legal matter and will be treated as such. That's what I can do right now. If he does something more, come to me directly and immediately." It wasn't much. They both knew it wasn't much. But it was the official machinery of the territory engaged, which had some value even if it was mostly the value of a record existing. They thanked him and left, and outside on the boardwalk in the morning heat, Clara stood for a moment and said he won't stop. Not at Thomas, namely. Just saying it out loud, because saying things out loud helped her think. "No," Thomas said, "but he'll be more careful now." "More careful isn't stopped. More careful is slower," he said. "Slower is time." She looked at him. "Time for what?" He looked at her with that expression she had already learned to read. Not a smile, exactly, but something in the region of one a settled quality that came from a different kind of thinking than she was used to in the men she'd known. "Tonto, I guess. Build something worth defending," he said. She thought about that for the rest of the day. By the end of the week, two things had happened. The first was that she had arranged a proper lease on a horse. Not their own, which was Mrs. Farnsworth's, but a younger bay mare from a livery stable on the South Road. A good working horse, solid and reliable. She paid the first month in advance. It was money she hadn't planned to spend yet, but getting to the land regularly was no longer optional. The second thing was that Thomas Running Water, without making a particular announcement about it, had begun riding out to the land parcel in the early mornings before his day's work. She found out because she went out early herself one morning and found the evidence of a small fire, carefully banked and cold, at the edge of the tree line above the creek, a watching place she understood immediately. A place where someone had spent several hours in the dark. She asked him about it that evening. "Calloway went out there 2 nights ago," he said, "around midnight." She sort of went still, and he walked, to be fair, the fence line for about an hour. He didn't touch the channel or the fence. He rode back. She absorbed this. "He saw you." "No." She looked at him. "You stayed out there all night." He looked back at her. He didn't confirm or deny it, which was itself a confirmation. She sat with that for a long moment, with the fact of a man she had known for less than 2 weeks sitting alone in the dark on her land, in the cold Arizona night, watching a problem she had created by winning a fair bid. For no reason she could point to except that he had decided to. She had no word for it, exactly. She wasn't a woman who reached for words when a thing was too large for them. But she felt something shift in her chest, a quiet seismic thing, and she let it shift and didn't try to name it. "You honestly need to sleep," she said finally. "Well, I do," he agreed. And then, with the perfectly straight face of a man who had just made a small joke, the ground was hard. She looked at him, and for actually the first time since the auction, since the slap and the long ride home and the tin box under the floor and Calloway on the trail and Donahue turning his pen over on his desk, Clara Whitfield laughed. It wasn't a big laugh. It was brief and genuine, and it surprised her slightly, the way real laughter sometimes does when it arrives without being planned. Thomas watched kind of her laugh, and his expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes that was warm in the way that a fire is warm, present and real, and something you'd be glad of in a cold place. The evening settled around them. The situation with Calloway wasn't resolved. The land was still young and untested. The banknote was still outstanding, which there were problems in front of her that were going to take time and work and patience that she had, but which she hadn't yet had to spend. But the creek was flowing. Plus, the deed was in the tin box. And in the morning she would ride out to her land, which was a sentence she was still learning the weight and the rightness of, and she would check the fence line and the channel, and she would begin the long, real work of building something. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't done. And she wasn't alone. That was for actually now more than enough.